One of the features of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection that always strikes me is that no one was expecting it. No one was expecting Jesus to die or rise from the dead. The women go to the tomb with the burial spices on Easter morning. Good Friday, Holy Saturday, Easter Sunday, the disciples are locked in the upper room, scared to death for what's going to happen to them. They weren't expecting it. And the kind of shocking thing about that is that it's not like Jesus didn't tell them. He did. In fact, multiple times in the Gospels, Jesus tells his disciples and followers that he is going to suffer, die, and rise again. Apparently, they didn't believe him. In today's gospel lesson from Mark chapter 9, we get a little insight into why they don't believe him. Mark tells us, after he tells us that he was teaching about his suffering, his death, and resurrection, Mark says, "But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him." They didn't understand and they were afraid to ask. It's sort of like, School 101. One of the first things we tell children when they go to school is if you don't understand something, ask a question. Go get extra help. We'll even say to adults, there is no stupid question. Just ask the question. But the disciples don't, out of fear. There are different kinds of fear. There's like existential fear, fear that we're going to be killed or maimed or hurt, that something's going to happen, it's going to be so terrible that it's going to affect the rest of our lives or end our life. That's not what's going on here. The disciples are not worried that Jesus is going to hurt them. They're worried that, I think the most charitable interpretation is that they're worried that Jesus might be disappointed, that he doesn't understand him. That Jesus would go, "Oh, guys, really? I've been telling this to you. You don't understand it." That maybe they're scared of disappointing Jesus. I think the more accurate thing here is that they were scared that their fellow compatriots, the other disciples, would make fun of them for asking the question. Like none of the disciples knew what was going on, but each of them worried that they were the only one that didn't know what was going on. And if they asked a question, then everyone else would make fun of them for asking the question. That's the kind of fear that we're dealing with here. So after looking at the fear, I'm kind of shocked at the ramifications of it. I mean, think about it. If the disciples were able to, build up the courage and the strength to surpass their fear and ask the question, then perhaps Jesus would have answered the question. If they had asked him, "Well, what are you talking about? What is this going to look like? Why on earth do you need to die? Who is your death going to benefit? How is your death going to positively impact my life and the life of every human being that will walk this earth for thousands of years?" If they had asked those questions, Jesus might have answered them. And if Jesus answered them, and they were able to come to some understanding, maybe they wouldn't have been locked in the upper room on Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter. Maybe everything else that Jesus had taught them in his earthly ministry would have come into greater focus. Like they wouldn't have just understood this, but they would have understood so much more of what Jesus was trying to do and say. If they asked the questions and Jesus answered the questions, and if Mark wrote those answers and questions down, we might have those answers today. Think of how much richer Christianity would have been had Jesus been afforded the opportunity to answer these questions. Jesus does teach that he is going to suffer, die, and rise again, but he's very thin on the why. He's very thin on the how does his death and resurrection affect us. He's very thin on the theology of the crucifixion and the resurrection. Any theology of the crucifixion and resurrection we get ultimately from the writings of Paul or from the epistle to the Hebrews. But we don't hear those words come out of Jesus' mouth. Had Jesus had a question to answer, and had he answered the question, might he have used a term or a phrase or a parable that was different than what Paul wrote, that it was different than what we find in Hebrews? Maybe he would have said something that would have added incredible color and context to the theology of the cross and the resurrection. Think of the hymns that those words could have inspired. Think of the sermons and books that those words could have inspired. We have dozens of major Christian denominations in our world, and we have thousands and thousands of little denominations in this world, little groups of Christians all over the place. A lot of the splitting off of this group and that group and that group and that group happened because this group disagreed with this group on what the cross meant, just a little bit. If Jesus had clarified things here, would there be fewer denominations today? With a little more information, with a little more theology, with a little more spirituality of the how and the why, would Christianity as a whole look completely different today? In that sense, the disciples' fear in asking this question, I think, had ramifications. The ripple effect, I think, affected the rest of their lives and ministry. But the ripple effect there didn't just stop 2,000 years ago. I think we are still experiencing the ripple effect of their fear to ask a question because they worried that someone might have made fun of them for asking the question. Think of the richness and the depth that we missed out on because of a little fear 2,000 years ago. And in this sense, the disciples really, as much as we can sort of look back on them and see them as sort of bumbling fools, they really aren't too different from us. I mean, they really aren't. We are the disciples. I mean, I've been a priest almost for 20 years, and the number of times I've spoken of prayer and had people come up to me and say, I don't know how to pray. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to pray for. I know what to pray for, but I don't know how to do it. I'm worried about saying the wrong thing. Fear. The number of times I've talked about reading the scriptures and studying the Bible, and people will come to me and go, I'd love to read the Bible, I just don't understand it. There's all those words and those places, and I don't know how to pronounce them. I don't know what they are. I don't know ancient history, so I'll just let you do it. It's fear. The number of people who I've talked to outside of the church that have said, well, I'd come to church, I'd like to come to church, but, I don't know. I don't know what to wear. I don't know what to do. You guys are Episcopalians. You have all these rituals, and you stand, you sit, you kneel, you stand, you sit, and you kneel. I don't know when to do that stuff. It's fear. People I've talked to about reconciling with somebody. And they'll say, I would forgive them, or I would ask them for forgiveness, but I don't know what they'll say. I would forgive them, but are they going to forgive me back? I don't know. I'd have that conversation, but I'm worried that it might turn out bad. Fear. And none of the fear that I'm talking about there is existential at all. It's all fear of rejection or being made fun of, or somehow God's going to think I said the wrong words. Just pray. Just read. Just have the conversation. Just come and sit in a pew. It's going to be okay. And think of if you were to do these things and overcome the fear, the ripple effects that might, affect the rest of your life. Think of it, if you developed a life of prayer, or you started studying the scriptures, or you started really forgiving people, or you started coming to church and sitting in a pew, how it might positively impact your life, not just now, but for the rest of your life. And then how those positive ripples might extend out to the next generation, and the next generation, and the next generation, the people that might be impacted by your prayers, by your presence, by your willingness to act out of faith instead of fear. The most often repeated commandment of the Bible is do not be afraid. And it's not don't be afraid or else. It's when you don't have to be afraid, and when you don't live in fear, wondrous, beautiful, and holy things can happen. Amen.